Chapter 21. It was after sunup now, but we went right on and didn't tie up. The king and duke turned out by and by, looking pretty rusty, but after they jumped overboard and took a swim, it chippered them up a good deal. After breakfast, the king he took a seat on the corner of the raft, took off his boots and rolled up his breeches, and let his legs dangle in the water, so as to be comfortable, and lit his pipe and went to getting his Romeo and Juliet by heart. When he had got it pretty good, him and the Duke began to practice it together. The Duke had to learn him over and over again how to say every speech, and he made him sigh and put his hand on his heart, and after a while he said he'd done it pretty well. "Only," he says, "you mustn't bellow out 'Romeo' like that way, like a bull. You must say it soft and sick and feverishly, like 'Romeo.' That's the idea. For Juliet's a dear, sweet, mere child of a girl, you know. She doesn't bray like a jackass." Well, next they got out a couple of long swords that the Duke had made out of oak laths and began to practice sword fight. The Duke called himself Richard III, and the way they laid on and pranced around the raft, it was grand to see. But by and by the king tripped and fell overboard. After that they took a rest and had to talk about all kinds of adventures they'd had in other times along the river. After the dinner, the Duke says, "Well, Capet, we'll want to make this a first-class show, you know, so I guess we'll add a little more to it. We want a little something to answer encores with anyway." "What's encores, Bilgewater?" And the Duke told him, and then says, "I'll answer by doing the Highland fling or the sailor's hornpipe. And you, well, let me see. Oh, I've got it. You can do Hamlet's soliloquy." "Hamlet's which?" "Hamlet's soliloquy. You know, the most celebrated thing in Shakespeare. Oh, it's sublime, sublime. It always fetches the house. I ain't got it in the book. I only got the one volume. But I reckon I can piece it out from memory. I'll just walk up and down a minute and see if I can call it back from the recollection vaults." So he went to marching up and down, thinking and frowning horrible every now and then he would hoist up his eyebrows. Next he would squeeze his hand on his forehead and stagger and kind of moan. Next he would sigh, and next he'd let it drop a tear. Or maybe a tear. Probably let on to drop a tear. It was beautiful to see. By and by he got it. He told us to give attention. Then he strikes a most noble attitude, with one leg shoved forward, and his arms stretched way up, his head tilted back, looking up at the sky. And then he begins to rip and rave and grit his teeth, and after all that, through all his speech, he howled and spread around and swelled up his chest, and just knocked the spots off of any acting I ever see before. This is his speech. I learned it easy enough while he was learning it to the king. "To be or not to be, that is the bear bodkin. That makes calamity so long life. For who would fetch Bardell's bear to Birnam Wood come down to Dunsinane? But that the fear of the something after death murders the innocent sleep, great nature's second course, and makes us rather sling the arrows of outrageous fortune, rather fly to others that we know not of. There's the respect must give us pause. Wake, Duncan, with thy knocking. I wouldst thou couldst. For who would bear the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the law's delay, and the quietus which pangs might take, in the dead waste of the middle of the night, when churchyards yawn in customary suits of solemn black, but that the undiscovered country, from which born no traveller returns, breathes forth contagion on the world, and thus the native hue of resolution, like the poor cat in the adage, is sickled over with care. And all the clouds that lowered o'er our house with their tops, and with this regard their currents turn awry, and lose in the name of action, 'Tis consummation, devoutly to be wished. But soft you, the fair Ophelia, ope not thy ponderous and marble jaws, but get thee to a nunnery. Get! Well, the old man, he liked that speech, and mighty soon he got it so he could do it first rate. It seemed like he was just born for it. And when he had his hand in and was excited, it was perfectly lovely to see the way he would rip and tear and rear up behind when he was getting it off. The first chance we got, the Duke, he had some show bills printed. After that, for 2 or 3 days we floated along. The raft was most uncommon lively place, for there weren't nothin' but sword fighting and rehearsing, as the Duke called it, going on all the time. One morning, when we was pretty well down the state of Arkansas, we come in sight of a little one-horse town in a big bend. So we tied up about 3/4 of a mile above it, in the mouth of a creek, which was shut in like a tunnel by cypress trees. And all of us but Jim took the canoe and went down to see if there was any chance in that place for our show. We struck it mighty lucky. There was going to be a circus there that afternoon, and the country people was already beginning to come in all kinds of old shackly wagons and on horses. The circus would leave before night, so our show would have a pretty good chance. The Duke, he hired the courthouse, and we went around, stuck up our bills, and they read like this: Shakespearean Revival, wonderful attraction for one night only. The world-renowned tragedians Derek Garrick, the younger of Drury Lane Theatre, London, and Edmund Kean the elder, of Royal Haymarket Theatre, Whitechapel, Pudding Lane, Piccadilly, London, and the Royal Continental Theatres, in their sublime Shakespearean spectacle, entitled The Balcony Scene in Romeo and Juliet. Romeo, played by Mr. Garrick, Juliet, played by Mr. Kean. Assisted by the whole strength of the company, new costumes, new scenery, new appointments. Also, the thrilling, masterly, and blood-curdling broadsword conflict in Richard III. Richard III, Mr. Garrick. Richmond, Mr. Kean. Also, by special request, Hamlet's immortal soliloquy by the illustrious Kean, done by him 3 consecutive nights in Paris, for one night only, on account of imperative European engagements. Admission, 25 cents. Children's servants, 10 cents. Well, then we went to loafing around town. The stores and houses was all old, shackly, dried-up frame concerns. I hadn't ever seen paint. They was set up 3 or 4 feet above the ground on stilts, so as to be out of the reach of the water when the river overflowed. The houses had little gardens around them, but they didn't seem to raise hardly anything in them except jimson weeds and sunflowers, and ash piles, and old curled-up boots and shoes, and pieces of bottles, and rags, and played-out tinware. The fences was made of different kinds of boards, nailed on at different times, and they leaned every which way, and the gates hadn't but generally one hinge, a leather one. Some of the fences had been whitewashed some time or another, but the Duke said it was in Columbus's time, like enough. There was generally hogs in the garden, and people driving them out. All the stores was along one street. They had white domesticated awnings in the front, and the country people hitched up their horses to the awning posts. There was empty dry goods boxes under the awnings, and loafers roosting on them all day long, whittling them with their barlow lives, and chawing tobacco, and gaping, and yawning, and stretching, a mighty ornery lot. They generally had on yellow straw hats most as wide as an umbrella, but didn't wear no coats, nor waistcoats. They called one another Bill, and Buck, and Hank, and Joe, and Andy, and talked lazy and drawly, and used considerable many cuss words. There was as many as one loafer leaning up against every awning post, and most always he had his hands in his breeches pockets, except when he fetched them out to lend a chaw of tobacco or a scratch. What a body was hearing amongst them all the time was, "Give me a chaw of tobacco, Hank." "Can't. Hain't got but the one chaw left. Ask Bill." Well, maybe Bill, he gives him a chaw. Maybe he lies and says he ain't got none. Some of them kinds of loafers has never a cent in the world, nor a chaw of tobacco of their own. They get all their chawing by borrowing. They say to a fellow, I wish you'd lend me a chaw, Jack. I just this minute give Ben Thompson the last chaw I had. Which is a lie pretty much every time. It don't fool nobody but a stranger. But Jack ain't no stranger. So he says, "You give him a chaw, did you? So did your sister's cat's grandmother. You pay me back for the chaws you already borrowed off of me. Then I'll loan you 1 or 2 ton of it. And won't charge you back no interest, nother." "Well, I did pay you back some of it once." "Yes, you did. About 6 chaws. You borrowed store tobacco, and you paid back Blackhead." Store tobacco is a flat black plug, but most of these fellows mostly chawed the natural leaf twisted. When they borrow chaw, they don't generally cut it off with a knife, but set the plug in between their teeth, and gnaw with their teeth, and tug at the plug with their 2 hands till they get it in 2. Then sometimes the one that owns the tobacco looks mournful. When he looks at it, handed it back, and says sarcastic, "Here, give me the chaw, and you take the plug." "Give me the chaw." Well, all the streets was just mud. There weren't nothing else but mud. Mud as black as tar, and nigh about a foot deep in some places, and 2 or 3 inches deep in all the places. The hogs loafed and grunted round everywheres, and you'd see a muddy sow and a litter of pigs some lazying along up the street, a wallop herself right down in the way, where folks had to walk around her, and she'd stretch out and shut her eyes and wave her ears whilst the pigs was milking her, and look as happy as if she was on celery. And pretty soon you'd hear a loafer sing out, "Hi, so boys, sick 'em tig!" And away the sow would go, squealing most horrible, with a dog or 2 swinging from each ear, and 2 or 3 dozen more of 'em a-coming. And then you would see all the loafers get up and watch the thing out of sight, and laugh at the fun, and look grateful for the noise. Then they'd settle back down again till there was a dog fight. There couldn't anything wake them up all over, make them all happy all over, like a dog fight. Unless it might be putting turpentine on a stray dog and setting him on fire, or tying a tin pan to his tail, and see himself run himself to death. On the riverfront, some of the houses was sticking out over the bank, and they was bowed and bent, and about ready to tumble in. The people had moved out of them. The bank was caved away all underneath the corners of some of the others, and that corner was hanging over. People lived in them yet, but it was dangersome, because sometimes a strip of land as wide as a house caves in at a time. Sometimes a belt of land a 1/4 mile deep will start in and cave along till it caves into the river in one summer. Such a town as that has always got to be moving back and back and back, because the river's always gnawing at it. Well, the nearer it got to noon, the day was thicker and thicker, and the wagons and the horses and the streets, and all more coming at the same time. Families fetched their dinners with them from the country and eat them in the wagons. There was considerable whiskey drinking going on, and I seen 3 fights. And by someone sings out, "Here comes old Boggs, in from the country with his little monthly drunk. Here he comes, boys." All the loafers looked glad, and I reckon they was used to having fun out of old Boggs. One of them says, "Wonder who he's going to chaw up this time. If he'd have chawed up all the men he'd been going to chaw up in the last 20 years, he'd have a considerable reputation by now." Another one says, "I wish old Boggs had threatened me, 'cause then I know I weren't going to die in 1,000 years." Well, Boggs comes a-tearing along on his horse, whooping and yelling like an Injun, and singing out, "Clear the track there! I'm on a warpath, and the price of the coffins is going to rise." He was drunk, and weaving about in his saddle. He was over 50 years old, and had a very red face. Everybody yelled at him and laughed at him and sassed him. He sassed back, and said he'd attend to them and lay them out in their regular turns. But he couldn't wait on them now, 'cause he'd come to town to kill old Sheriff Sherburne. Not Sheriff Sherburne, Colonel Sherburne, totally different person. He'd come to town to kill old Colonel Sherburne. And his motto was, "Meat first, and spoon victuals on top of that." Well, he seen me and rode up and says, "Where'd you come from, boy? You prepared to die?" And he rode on. I was scared. But a man says, he don't mean nothing. He's always carrying on like that when he's drunk. He's the best naturedest old fool in Arkansas. Never hurt nobody, drunk nor sober. Boggs rode up before the biggest store in town and bent his head down so he could see under the curtain of the awning and yells, "Come out here, Sherburne! Come out here and meet the man you've swindled. You're the hound I'm after, and I'm going to have at you, too." And so he went on, calling Sherburne everything he could lay his tongue to, and the whole street packed with people listening and laughing and going on. And by, a proud-looking man of about 55, and he was as heap the best-dressed man in that town, too, steps out of the store, and the crowd drops back on each side to let him come. And he says to Boggs, mighty calm and slow, he says, "I'm tired of this, but I'll endure it till 1 o'clock. Till 1 o'clock, mind. No longer. You open your mouth against me only once after that time, and you can't travel so far, but I'll find you, Boggs." Then he turns and goes in. The crowd looked mighty sober. Nobody stirred. There weren't no more laughing. Boggs rode off. Blackguard Sheriff Sherburne did it in. Colonel Sherburne. Blackguard Colonel Sherburne, as loud as he could yell, all down the street. And pretty soon he comes back and stops before the store, still keeping it up. Some men crowded around him and tried to get him to shut up, but he wouldn't. And they told him it would come to 1 o'clock in about 15 minutes, so he must go home. He must go right away. But it didn't do no good. He cussed away with all his might and throwed his hat down in the mud and rode over it. And pretty soon he went away a-raging around down the street again, his gray hair a-flying. Everybody that could get a chance at him tried their best to coax him off his horse so they could lock him up and get him sober, but it weren't no use. Up the street he would tear again, giving Sherburne another cussing. And by someone says, "Go for his daughter! Quick, go for his daughter! Sometimes he'll listen to her. If anybody can persuade him, he can." So somebody started on a run. I walked down the street a ways and stopped. In about 5 or 10 minutes, here comes Boggs again, but not on his horse. He was a-reeling across the street toward me, bareheaded, with a friend on both sides of him, a holt of his arms, and hurrying him along. He was quiet and looked uneasy. He weren't hanging back any, but was doing himself some hurrying of his own. Somebody sings out, "Boggs!" I looked over there to see who it was. It was that Colonel Sherburne. He was standing perfectly still in the street, had a pistol raised in his right hand, not aiming it, but holding it out with the barrel tilted up towards the sky. That same second I seen a girl come running on the run, and 2 men behind her. Boggs and the men turned around to see who called him, and when they see the pistol, the men jumped to one side, and the pistol barrel come down slow and steady to a level, both barrels cocked. Boggs, he throws up his hands and says, "Oh, Lord, don't shoot!" Bang goes the first shot. He staggers back, clawing at the air. Bang goes the second one, and he tumbles backward onto the ground, heavy and solid. His arms spread out, and that young girl screamed out and comes a-rushing, and down throws herself on her father, crying and saying, "Oh, he's killed him! He's killed him!" The crowd closed up around him and shouldered and jammed one another, with their necks stretched, trying to see, and the people on the inside trying to shove them back and shouting, Get back! Give him air! Give him air!" Colonel Sherburne tossed his pistol onto the ground and turned on his heel and walked off. They took old Boggs to a little drugstore, the crowd pressing around just the same, and the whole town following. I rushed and got a good place at the window, where I could see him close, and I could see in. They laid him on the table and put one large Bible under his head, and opened up another one and spread it on his breast. But they tore open his shirt first to see where one of the bullets went in. And he made a dozen long gasps, his breast lifting up the Bible and drawing his breath, and then letting it down again when he breathed it out. And after that, he laid still. He was dead. Then they pulled his daughter away from him, screaming and crying, and took her off. She was about 16, very sweet and gentle looking, but awful pale and scared. Well, pretty soon the whole town was there, squirming and scourging and pushing and shoving to get at the window and have a look. But the people that had their places wouldn't give 'em up. So the folks behind them all the time saying, "Say now, you've looked enough, you fellows. 'Tain't right, 'tain't fair for you to stay in there all the time, never give another body a chance. Folks got their rights as well." So there was considerable jawing back, and I slid out, thinking maybe there was going to be trouble. The streets was full, and everybody was excited. Everybody that had seen the shooting was telling how it happened. And there was a big crowd packed around each of these fellows, stretching their necks and listening. One long, lanky man with long hair and a big white fur stovepipe hat on the back of his head, and a crooked-handled cane, marked out the places on the ground where Boggs had stood and Sherburne had stood. And the people following him around from one place to the other, watching everything he done, and bobbing their heads to show they understood, and stooping a little, and resting their hands on their thighs to watch him mark on the places on the ground with his cane. And then he stood up straight and stiff where Sherburne had stood, frowning and having his hat brimmed down over his eyes, and sung out, "Boggs!" And then he fetched his cane down slow to a level and says, "Bang!" Staggered backwards, "Bang!" and fell down flat on his back. People had seen the thing, said he'd done it just perfect. Said that's exactly the way it all happened. Then as much as a dozen people got out their bottles and treated him. Well, by and by somebody said Sherburne ought to be lynched. In about a minute everybody was saying it. So away they went, mad and yelling, snatching down every clothesline they could come up to do the hanging with. And that's the end of chapter 21.